I feel like I was all over the map with this one, so I just really hope it makes sense. Hi squad, welcome back, and dog bless you. I am extra out of it today because I had my second COVID vaccine yesterday, and I'm really happy that I got that done, but I'm very dizzy and confused, and my brain is pudding. Which is to say, if I look sleepy and my lighting's crap, I don't want to hear about it. I know. Today's topic is important to me. I mean, not the thing itself, that can just heck right off, but conversations about it, just because I don't really think that they happen enough. Transition fatigue. Despite that name paired with the context of being here on a trans guy's YouTube channel, transition fatigue isn't actually specific to transgender people. In fact, when I was kind of digging up more about it, I didn't really find anything linking those two things. I'm not saying that those conversations haven't happened or that I'm the first person to point this out, just that it's just, I don't know, it's just not usually talked about in the context of a literal trans person transition. The term transition fatigue, based on what I was able to dig up, was coined by Catherine Hosey? Catherine Hosey? I think it's Catherine Hosey. It's always a name that's really, really terrible for me to try and pronounce in my dumb little backwater Ontario accent. Regardless, she coined it as part of her approach to coaching psychology, which is her area of expertise. I was also able to find a little bit about transition fatigue from a financial institution that talks about it in terms of, well, finances. Basically, the current conversations about transition fatigue focus mostly on career, leadership, and professional development. More generally, transition fatigue is change-induced exhaustion. It describes the weariness that people experience when they undergo big life changes. Moving to a new place, starting a new job, having a child, going through a divorce, really anything that impacts the overall structure of your life. But I'm gonna go ahead and hit it with the transgenderification beam because, of course I am. It's important to keep in mind that everybody's sensitivity levels and breaking points are different, but generally speaking, the more areas of your life that are impacted by something, the more tiring that thing's going to be, because you don't get to take breaks from it. This is very much the case with transition, whether it's medical, social, or both. And for the remainder of this video, when I say transition, it may be speaking about one of those things or both of those things because it looks different to every single person undergoing a transition. Everyone views and categorizes their lives differently, but I've gone with three primary life facets for the purpose of this conversation. And those are social, so our interactions with other people around us; civil, which describes our responsibilities and existence within a structured community; and psychological. That one's pretty self-explanatory. The reason I've structured it this way is to help people who are not trans get a better understanding of just what it's like to transition and all of the things that are kind of looming over you, especially when you're in the early phases. I also wanted to provide a means of organizing and understanding thoughts, feelings, and actions surrounding transition for people who are in the midst of one. So let's jump in. But before we do, just a reminder: not a psychologist, not a therapist, not any kind of mental health professional. I'm just a random guy on the internet who has a lot of feelings. One of the tough things about being trans and being open about that fact or undergoing a transition is that other people exist around you. That's not the tough thing on its own, obviously. Other humans are pretty great. Generally, I like them. What's hard about it is the inevitable demands that it places on trans people, particularly at the start of their journeys. Mostly because coming out never ends. Ever. It just keeps going. There's a reason that a lot of trans people relocate to completely new places once they've started living as their authentic selves. Because it's not just friends and family that you have to come out to. Oh no. It's also their friends and family. The baristas at your favorite coffee shop. Your boss. Your coworkers, your clients or customers, medical staff, anyone in an administrative position that would grant them access to any documents that have your birth name on them, and literally any other human being you've had enough casual encounters with to vaguely recognize in the street. Either there's an explicit coming out conversation, or you have to deal with them kind of awkwardly side-eyeing you until you address the elephant in the room. The constant air of discomfort as you navigate the world, having to sort of explain the correct version of yourself, isn't really anyone's fault. Of course it's going to be an adjustment for everyone. But even if their questioning and confusion comes from a really understandable place, it's still really exhausting and unpleasant to have to deal with, especially when it's all the time. It's also part of the reason why the reactions of people close to us can have such an impact. Because when you're out interacting with the world and having all of those awkward encounters, it can start to make you feel really alien, especially when you're right in the midst of trying to correct a pre-existing sense of dissociation or discomfort with yourself. Your home life and close social circle should provide a break from that discomfort as they would in other circumstances. But they can't do that if by the nature of your very existence, the emotional states of the people around you have become tumultuous. For many people, as soon as you tell them that you're trans, it becomes about them, their questions, and their feelings around that fact. And that's not to say that cis people can't have their feelings. When someone really close to you, like a spouse, a parent, or a child, comes out as trans, that's a lot to unpack. Maybe one day it won't be, but in the current state of the world, it definitely is. Given this, people absolutely need space and support to unpack those feelings and work through their reactions. But I've mentioned this before. Putting that problem on the trans person in question makes more emotional labor for them at what is already a really difficult, really tiring time in their life. If your life is very closely tied to a trans person, like a spouse, you might actually get a taste of the awkwardness of that constant coming out and the stares and the whispers and the confusion and people waiting for you to bring something up. It really sucks, but you have an identity outside of it. They don't. It can be really hard for trans people to get a good understanding of themselves and the steps that they need to take to feel better and more at home in their identities when they're constantly having to separate their own feelings from the feelings of the people around them. That means that while it might seem like a good thing to bring your feelings and confusion to them to discuss, it's only going to cause more difficulties in the long run and extend the painful phase for everyone involved. So if you're a cis person and someone that you love just told you that they're trans, really think about how you're reacting and where you're placing that reaction. If your primary concern is helping your trans loved one work through their feelings, and I'd imagine it is, ask yourself if you think that they can really do that if they're constantly having to separate their feelings about their trans identity from your feelings about their trans identity. And if you're a trans person trying to figure out how to proceed, take some time to think about where your negative and positive feelings are coming from. It might be helpful, if very challenging, to try and imagine yourself separate from your personal relationships and to think about what that person, that is you, looks like in those instances. That is, if you got a completely fresh start, what would that look like? But trans or cis, don't be afraid to reach out to a therapist or any kind of specialist who can help you work through your feelings. This is a pretty short section because anyone who's had to call a government office about anything ever knows the torment that is trying to engage with bureaucracy. I don't think I need to explain that. I mostly just want to address it as sort of an additional thing that can be looming over people and draining all of your mental and emotional resources. Because like coming out, this is not a one and done kind of deal. Oh no. You need to separately address every document associated with your identity, at least in most places. So we're talking birth certificate, driver's license, passport, the deed to your home if you're not a Zoomer or millennial trying to navigate the housing hellscape wrought by our predecessors. Point is, it's a lot. Most people would rather jump rope on a sea of Lego at the best of times rather than address something like that, let alone at a time that is already really mentally and emotionally taxing. A lot of people don't even bother or put it off until it's absolutely necessary. Personally, I found it helpful to channel some of my anxious transition energy into accomplishing these tasks, mostly because they were things that I could at least control. But many people may prefer to hold off until their social transition has settled so that they can be certain it's something that they really want. Takeaway point: don't be afraid to ask yourself whether these things are a help or a hindrance to your comfort and sense of self. And remember that you don't have to jump in and address all of them at once. Also remember that you're allowed to be salty about all of the annoying hoops that you have to jump through. And I have no words of wisdom on that one, just know that you have clearance to be grumpy from some Seth Green stand-in on the internet. And finally, we're going to talk about the last point that I would like to discuss. Transition is a very exciting thing. It's a very exciting time, but the fact that it can be so exhausting can really mess with your head and how you approach it. Because we tend to be fed this image of transition as wildly challenging, but then defeated by the sheer conviction of your gender truth. Even in the rare instances where we get good portrayals of trans people in the media, it still tends to be framed with a lot of certainty and this promise of relief once you've finally begun your transition or completed your transition. I don't think I really need to go over the bad portrayals, but that just tends to be, misery and longing to strength and self-actualization because you're finally free and blah blah, trapped in the wrong body, blah blah. Point is, the depictions of trans narratives tend to be reduced to this intense certainty and drive around transition for better or for worse. No one really talks about the loss and subsequent rebuilding of your imagined future, or of being paralyzed to the point of inaction by all of the steps that you need to take. No one really talks about the very common, very tiring self-doubt loop that's telling you that if you're that intimidated by the steps you have to take, maybe you're not really trans in the first place. Maybe you've just convinced yourself that you're trans, or at the very least you're not trans enough to justify taking those steps. No one really talks about the fact that you might feel worse before you feel better. Maybe people who didn't even realize that they were trans until they experienced gender euphoria for the first time, then experienced dysphoria after putting it into words, because they didn't really have the context and understanding for those feelings to manifest. So when trans people in the real world begin to take those steps to just be true to themselves, they're often not prepared for the strong possibility of feeling worse or hitting points where they just kind of want to give up on transition. Because being told that you'll find freedom and relief only to be hit with draining social interactions, legal obligations, and an unsteady, unsettling sense of self can be quite a shock. There's a reason that the vast majority of trans healthcare programs check in frequently on your mental health and your support structures. Feeling like you don't want to proceed with transition is very understandable, because you're having to work through immediate distress for the promise of relief that you've never actually felt before and therefore don't really know how much to invest in. It's just kind of a leap of faith. Now, before anyone gets up my butt about encouraging people to transition when they have doubts, that is absolutely 110% not what I'm saying, so please don't take it there. That's a topic for another video and I will discuss it. What I am saying is that if you're someone who knows who you are and what that's supposed to look like, but you feel less valid due to being overwhelmed by all of the exhausting steps that you have to take, tell your brain to shut up for a moment. Transition is tiring. You can't walk a mile without taking single steps, and the messages that you've likely been given telling you that you're running out of time are complete and utter nonsense. All you have is time. So take your time, and take rests, and give yourself space to not feel like you have to be this feminine or this masculine or this androgynous to prove yourself. Take this as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about yourself, to ask yourself questions about the kind of person that you want to be, without putting pressure on yourself to share that person with others before you're ready. You don't need to have a completely solidified view of the version of yourself that you're trying to achieve. Part of this process is learning more about who that person actually is. Every step you take in your transition is worth celebrating on its own. You don't have to reach this arbitrary end goal that you've set up in your mind to be worthy of resting and worthy of loving yourself. That can and should start right now. I am going to talk about this more in the follow-up that I mentioned previously, don't worry. To tie all of this together, part of why I really wanted to make this video was to remind trans people who are in the early phases of transition that they're not wrong or confused or less trans for hitting those points where they don't really want to move forward or experience regret for telling people that they're trans before they were really ready to be open about that. Being worn down by changes, especially when there's a whole bunch of them happening really quickly, doesn't mean that those changes aren't right for you. It just means that you, like every other human, have a breaking point. Having said that, I do think it's really important to stress that if you have taken a step in transition that you don't think was right for you, or you sincerely want to pause your transition for whatever reason, that is perfectly okay. You are still a part of this community if you want to be. Some people might not agree with me on that, but I stand by it because I don't really suffer the opinions of people who build their identities and principles around exclusion. There aren't really many examples in human history of that being a good thing. At the end of the day, there is no one correct image of what trans looks like, just as there's no one correct image of what cis looks like. You are allowed to be yourself, and you're allowed to explore who that person is without feeling committed to things that you don't want or guilty for changing your mind. But I've rambled on long enough, and I'm going to discuss some of these topics more in the video that I plan on making about detransitioners and detransitioning, so if that's something that interests you, stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks for watching.